Welcome back. Again, this is Lew Miller, and we are at part 3 of our story of how Lincoln became president. What Lincoln knew was that the election was between himself and Stephen Douglas. Period. End of discussion. The electoral votes needed to win were all in the North. He, and arguably Douglas, had no shot in the South, and Breckinridge and Bell had no shot in the North. The contest would be won or lost in the northern battleground states, especially Pennsylvania, Indiana, and Illinois. The Republican Party that Lincoln now led had been formed 6 years before in the wake of the passage of Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act, which opened up Western territories to the possibility of becoming slave states. Immediately on its passage, protest movements against the law in northern states coalesced into a new political party, the Republicans. 2 years later, in 1856, this brand new party tried to elect a president. Now in 1860, it stood on the brink of actually doing so. But the party was a fragile coalition. It was made up of former Whigs and former Northern Democrats, men who had spent decades waging political warfare and who hated each other. It also contained former Know-Nothings who hated immigrants, like the German Americans, who also made up a segment of the party. And then there were the abolitionists, many of whom didn't really trust any political party, and whom all the other Republicans kept an eye on for signs they might do something truly radical that would scare the voters. Lincoln's ability to meld all these various disparate elements together into a formidable election-winning political organization was one of his great achievements. Behind the scenes, he was a master intriguer, firing off letters, telling someone to do something, but then cautioning, "Don't tell anybody I told you to do this." Yet in public, he always showed everyone respect. Or as in the case of the Know-Nothings, whom he loathed, he just kept quiet, saying nothing about them at all. At all times, he wanted to keep the party's dirty laundry behind closed doors. He repeatedly advised his varied supporters, say nothing on points where it's possible we should disagree. Elections in 1860 were conducted differently than they are today, and we need to look at a few of the key differences. First, only white men aged 21 or over could vote. No women, and mostly no blacks. However, again, different from today, the voters voted in large numbers. In the 1860 election, over 81% of eligible voters voted. For a comparison, in 2016, about 55% of eligible voters voted. Also, in 1860, in many states, they conducted their state elections in months other than November. Seems a little strange, but we will soon see about 2 battleground states that elected governors in October, indicating how the November results would go. And there was no secret ballot in 1860. The secret ballot did not become widespread in the United States until the late 19th and early 20th century. If you look at the man in the red shirt, he is voting by handing his ballot, which you were supposed to sign on the back, to the election judge. In some states, voting was done orally. Your name was called, and you called out your preferred vote. And finally, the government did not print the ballots. Each party was responsible for having its ballots printed and distributed beforehand. Because there was no Republican Party organization in 10 southern states, there were no Republican ballots available to be voted there. However, Lincoln ballots were available in 5 of the slave states where a modest Republican Party organization existed: in Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri. On the right is a Lincoln ballot from Virginia. As you can see, voters were actually voting by name for the candidates' electors to the Electoral College. In the middle is a ballot from Massachusetts, where both federal and state offices were being voted on. So there you could also be voting for governor and down ballot offices as well. And on the left is the Virginia ballot, for the Southern Democratic ticket's John Breckinridge. One campaign theme the Republicans played up was the corruption of the Democratic Buchanan administration, which frankly was historic in its scope and brazenness. The reason for the stress on corruption was that voters who might be indifferent to the Republicans' main theme of keeping slavery out of the territories would still be encouraged to vote Republican just to end the corruption in Washington. By the way, Lincoln hated the name Abe. He expected to be addressed as either Lincoln or Mr. Lincoln. Another campaign theme the Republicans hammered away at was the upward mobility represented by Lincoln's life story of being literally born in a log cabin, working as a manual laborer, and using that work to rise in society. This appealed to many young men eager to make their way up the ladder from rags to riches. Republican strategists targeted young voters and got them registered and turned them out to vote. Lincoln received a significant majority of the under 25 vote across the North, and it likely made a big difference in the western states. Another reason Lincoln attracted the youth vote was the wide awake clubs. This idea started in Connecticut, where a group of young men working security for a local candidate got the idea of marching into his meetings like a military drill team. The idea spread virally across the North among other young men, and hundreds of similar clubs were formed. They added flaming torches and a band playing marching music for night meetings, and the result was always a spectacular show that drew big crowds. This particular scene is a gigantic October parade up Broadway in New York City shortly before Election Day. Notice the fireworks in the background. Southerners, perhaps predictably, interpreted the wide awakes phenomenon as a potential future invasion force. What was being said about the candidates? Republicans repeatedly spread the rumor that Douglas was a Catholic. Why? Because they needed the votes of those former know-nothing voters, anti-Catholic to the core, who lived predominantly in the southern areas of the battleground northern states like Pennsylvania, Indiana, and Illinois. Lincoln despised the know-nothings, but he needed their votes. Douglas, in fact, was not Catholic. He was actually, at least nominally, an evangelical Baptist who at one point gave $1.5 million in today's money to start a Baptist college in Chicago. However, Douglas's second wife, Adele, was Catholic, and he allowed her to raise his two sons as Catholics, lending perhaps just a bit of credence to the charge. Breckinridge was accused of favoring secession, a claim he denied, but since he actually joined the secessionist cause in 1861, there may have been something to the charge. The best that anyone could come up with about Bell was that he and his supporters were rather old, which they were, not a particularly scandalous charge. With Lincoln, the accusations took on three themes. He wasn't very smart, a charge that we would shake our heads at today, but this was a political campaign after all. The more serious ones were that he was secretly an abolitionist, which to Southerners was tantamount to treason, and that he favored social and political equality of the races, which in 1860 he did not. Lincoln followed the tradition of his day and did no actual campaigning himself, although behind the scenes he was firing off daily letters directing the operations of his supporters in the key states. Instead, he occasionally entertained groups of supporters at his home. Lincoln is the tall figure in the white coat just to the right of the front door. You can see that, successful lawyer that he was, he had a fairly substantial home. Notice the African Americans grouped near the left side of the house. African Americans made up only about 1% to 2% of northern states' populations, and it was only legal for them to vote in 4 New England states and in New York if they owned property. They were barred from voting in the other 13 free states. Breckinridge and Bell, like Lincoln, did not actively campaign. In contrast, Stephen Douglas did. He crisscrossed the North, delivering fiery speeches defending his let the people decide position on slavery. Yet he declined to attack Lincoln directly. However, his efforts failed to generate much enthusiasm. His campaign money man, a New York financier named August Belmont, who would go on to found the Belmont Stakes racetrack, told him that the usual big money Democratic donors were keeping their wallets closed, sensing a Douglas defeat. In October, Douglas was in Iowa, still clinging to the hope of an Election Day miracle, when he learned the results of state elections in Pennsylvania and Indiana, two of the key battleground states he had to win. In both cases, the Republican candidate for governor swept to victory. Douglas knew what that meant. Lincoln is president. We must try to save the Union. I will go south. Douglas feared that a Lincoln presidency would break up the country. Douglas and his wife traveled to Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Mississippi, and Alabama at great personal risk. His life was threatened on numerous occasions. He pleaded with the sullen, hostile crowds to preserve the sacred Union, even if Lincoln won. Southerners did not want to hear it. In Montgomery, Alabama, close to Election Day, he spoke yet again. In the crowd that day, uninspired by the message, was a young actor, a member of a traveling theatrical group, John Wilkes Booth. Election Day came, and here are the results. Lincoln swept 17 free states, including every battleground state except for a split in New Jersey, and he easily won an electoral college victory. Douglas won only Missouri and that New Jersey split with Lincoln. But Lincoln received less than 40% of the popular vote. The result came as a shock to voters across the Deep South, where there had been no Lincoln ballots. How could he be the next president? And they knew for a fact, because they had read it in their newspapers, that he was a rabid abolitionist bent on destroying their way of life. Here we can view the results by county. Counties in red were won by Lincoln, with the darker the color indicating the greater the winning margin. Douglas won counties in blue. You can see that there were essentially two different elections taking place. In the North, where the electoral votes were, the contest was strictly between Lincoln and Douglas, while in the South, it was between Breckinridge in green and Bell in yellow-orange. Here are the results for Delaware. Lincoln finished third, but just 66 votes behind Bell in second place. For what it's worth, this was by far his best showing in a slave state. Overall, in those 5 slave states, he received about 25,000 votes. That was 1.3% of his national vote total of just over 1.8 million. This is the Harper's Weekly cover announcing Lincoln's election. Once again, we see the February Matthew Brady photograph again, which by November had become iconic. And this time, they spelled Abraham right. Then just 6 weeks after his election, in December 1860, a South Carolina convention voted to secede from the Union. They voted to do so in Institute Hall, where in April, Stephen Douglas had been denied the United Democratic Party nomination. South Carolina was followed in short order by 6 other Deep South states. And in February 1861, in Montgomery, Alabama, where 4 months before, Douglas had pleaded with a sullen crowd to preserve the Union, Jefferson Davis was sworn in before a cheering crowd as President of the Confederate States of America. Now it is March 4, 1861, Outgoing President Buchanan had his carriage stop at the Willard Hotel to pick up President-elect Lincoln, and they rode together in an open carriage up Pennsylvania Avenue to the nation's capital. On the roofs of the buildings they passed, Army sharpshooters were stationed, trained to spot and disrupt any potential assassination attempt, of which many were rumored. At the Capitol, a crowd of 25,000 had gathered to hear the new president speak for the first time about the crisis facing the nation. The great Capitol dome we know today was at the time still under construction. On the stage, in front of the East Portico, all the political worthies of the day were assembled. Among them, in the front row, was Stephen Douglas. When Lincoln was introduced, he stepped forward, took off his top hat, and looked around for some place to put it. Douglas reached out, took the hat from him, and held it in his lap as Lincoln began his first inaugural address. The last paragraphs of the speech were addressed directly to Lincoln's fellow citizens in the seceded states. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government. Well, I shall have the most solemn one, to preserve, protect, and defend it. I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone, all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. If you are interested in what happened to all the people we have met in our story, here is how life played out for them in later years. Seward became Lincoln's Secretary of State. He survived an assassination attempt the night that Lincoln was killed and lived into his 70s. Solomon Chase, Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury, repeatedly handed Lincoln his resignation letter, and Lincoln always stuck them in a drawer and ignored them. And then when Lincoln had had enough, one day when Chase gave him a resignation letter, Lincoln accepted it. Chase was surprised. Later that same year, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court died, and Lincoln's friends all told him, please, please, please don't appoint Chase. But Lincoln knew superior mind, and he appointed Chase to the Supreme Court. Edward Bates was a very competent Attorney General for Lincoln. He resigned after he had a stroke in 1864 and died shortly after. Lincoln and David Davis fell out for a time, but when another Supreme Court seat became open, Lincoln appointed him to the court. He later was named senator from Illinois and died a multimillionaire at age 71. Norman Judd started out on the list that Lincoln made of potential cabinet appointees. However, he never got that cabinet appointment, perhaps because Mrs. Lincoln never forgave him for once blocking her husband's path to being a senator. John Breckinridge fled the country. He went to England and then Canada, fearing he would be charged with treason. But he was pardoned by President Johnson just before Johnson left the presidency, and returned to Kentucky to become a corporate attorney. John Bell, who said he was against secession, ultimately approved of secession, lost his friends, and died shortly after the war. And finally, Stephen Douglas supported the Union. When Fort Sumter was fired upon, he went to the White House and asked Lincoln, what are you going to do? Lincoln said, I'm going to call out 75,000 volunteers. Douglas said, "Make it 200,000. Douglas understood the great antipathy in the Deep South for Lincoln and the Republicans. But Douglas's health got worse. In April, he returned to Illinois, and in June, he died at age 48 of typhoid fever and cirrhosis of the liver. This concludes our presentation on how Abraham Lincoln became President of the United States. I'd like to thank the Delaware Public Archives for their assistance in preparing this presentation. Thank you.